Now that we have a working navigation that sends ID numbers through the links up to the get variables that we can then pull down in the content area when the page reloads, we're ready to start making the content area a little more full-featured. And we're ready to start pulling back down data that's going to go in that content area and eventually develop it into a full CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. We're going to start by just getting it to read. So what I want to do first is to try to learn to read those subject IDs and turn it into meaningful information from the database about the subject. Let's do that now. Now, we're already sending the ID here. We have SEL_SUBJ, and that is the selected subject ID. So we know we have an ID that's ready to work with. In the navigation, we saw how we could write a function like getPagesForSubject that would go ahead and take a subject ID and pull down the pages that were related to it. We can do the same kind of thing for select_subject. We could do it the same way we did before by writing our code in the content area and then refactoring it out to our functions. But since we already know that we want to put it in the functions, why not go ahead and start there? So let's open up our functions file. And I'm going to go ahead and just close these up. There we go. TextMate has a nice feature that lets those fold. And I'm going to start a new function. We're going to call it getSubjectById. And it's going to have subject ID as its argument. Now, as a starting place, we could certainly just grab the code from above, from one of the other ones we did, and work with that and edit it. But I actually want to show you a different way to construct your queries. So let's go ahead and write our query string by hand, which is going to be query equals select space, and then I'm going to close my quotes and put a semicolon and start a new line. And I'm going to do query again. This time, though, I'm going to do the append equals command. So we're going to attach another string onto the end of that. We're basically building up our query line by line. So we have from subjects space semicolon. And then let's do query again. And we're going to need a where statement where ID equals, and then I can go ahead and just put in subject ID, semicolon. Now, last of all, I'm going to do something that we haven't done in query yet, which is limit 1. Now, this is a special MySQL command that will tell it to limit the results to only 1. If you find 20, only give me 1 back, because what I'm interested in here is one subject. Now, when we're using ID, because ID was declared as a primary field, it is going to make sure that it's unique. MySQL should take care of that for us, and there should be only one thing that has that ID. But we're going to just make extra sure by putting in that limit equals 1. And that's also going to help remind us when we come look at our code that we are expecting to get one and only one row back. We'll do the same thing when we're working with updates and deletes to make sure that we only update and delete one row. MySQL will 99.9% of the time handle it fine, but we'll go ahead and put in that extra layer of security by adding the command. And then we know how to call our result. We say result set equals MySQL query, and we'll put in our query string and connection. And I put too many ends in connection. And also, we know from experience working with the functions above, connection hasn't been passed into the function, so we'll have to ask for the global value of connection before we try to use it. So we'll do that at the top of the function. Now, we have a result set, and in the past, we simply returned that result set back to the user. But since we're only going to have one row, why should we pass in a container that has only one object in it back to the user? Instead, let's just pass the single row, the single subject, not a subject inside a container that'll force us to reach inside the container each and every time we want that subject out. The way that we quote-unquote reach inside that resource is with that MySQL fetch array. So we'll do subject equals MySQL fetch array and, of course, result set. So now we can return the subject. Now, based on everything we've talked about so far, that probably looks fine, but there are a couple of things that we need to fix before we can leave this. First, I want to show you why we did the query this way. A lot of developers like to build up their query strings because sometimes you're developing a query string, maybe it has if-then statements that decide whether or not something gets put into the string or not. Maybe you want to be able to comment out a line quickly to test and see whether or not that line is what is breaking things, or if you want to check if you had a different result. Or you might have several different versions of a line, and you could try out each one by commenting out the other two. So that's one advantage. But there's one caveat that we need to make very sure about. The query string that I've written right there will not work for us. It will not parse as valid MySQL. Can you spot the reason why? What we've done is appended all the strings together. So it's going to simply take each string and smash it together with the string that came before it. So I have a space here between the asterisk and from, so when it gets put together, there'll be a space between them. And the same thing between subjects and where. But look what happens here. ID equals, and then the ID. So let's say the ID was 3. So it'd be ID equals 3, and then immediately after the 3, it would append limit 1. So when SQL goes to look at it, it's going to look like it says ID equals 3LIMIT. And it's going to say, I don't know what that means. I don't have an ID by that, and it doesn't make any sense to me. So it's very important that we either put a space here in front of limit, or I like to even better put the space here to remind myself, or do an inline substitution. Use our brackets and just put it directly into the double quotes. But I just wanted to point it out because it's very important if we're building up a string that we always have that space after each of the values before we start a new one right here. You could also get in the habit of always just putting a space at the beginning of your line. Having 2 spaces won't hurt you. So it's up to you, but I just want to let you know what that problem is so you don't run into it. Now I also notice here that I forgot to put in my confirm query function. So let's go ahead and drop that in. Confirm query. And we're going to test the result set to make sure that the query exists. There's one other thing that I want us to consider here and think about what we're going to do with. Before, when we were working with reaching inside a container to pull back a row using MySQL fetch array, we were doing it inside the context of a while loop. And we were actually doing it as part of that Boolean expression attached to the while statement. So, as I pointed out, each time it would move the pointer to the next point in the result set, all the way along until it ran out of rows, and then it would return false, and that would make the loop stop running. Well, that also meant that if we pulled down the result set and there was no data inside of it, we got a successful result set back, it succeeded, but there was nothing inside, then the loop would just not execute, and we would get no rows output. But in this case, that's actually going to return false to subject. So if we do a query for a subject ID that doesn't exist in the database, let's say we ask for 500, what we're going to get is subject equal to the Boolean false. And maybe we handle that appropriately. Maybe once this returns with returns false, and maybe that's fine for us. Maybe we want to make a note to ourselves that we're going to return false out of this if we don't find anything, and that's fine. But we also can test for that here and return something else. So I'm going to go ahead and do that just so that we have that structure in place and you'll actually see it. So it's if this succeeds. So if this returns a true value, anything besides false, then do the next bit. So let's say we're going to make it just simply return the subject. So if the subject succeeds, in other words, is equal to anything besides false, meaning there was a row there, then return the subject. Else, we're going to have to do something else. We're going to return, and let's say we'll return null. Or we could return something different, or we could execute some different bit of code. Maybe we have it look up the default ID. Maybe we tell it to try again using ID 1 and return that. There are a variety of options of what we can do here. The key thing that I want to make you understand, though, is that subject will equal false if there's nothing inside of there. So we have a result set, successfully came back to us, but if there are no rows in there, then subject will equal false. So let's go ahead and just make ourselves a little note here. If no rows are returned, fetch array will return false. And I can actually go ahead and put myself something here that says remember. We've handled it in this case. Maybe not as elegantly as we could, but we've simply said either return the row, the subject, or send back null. So just keep that in mind, and let's go ahead and use getSubjectById. So I'm just going to copy it so we can use it. I'll save functions to make sure that's saved, and then I'll move back over to content, and let's go ahead at the very top of our document and find that. So we'll do it right here, and let's just say that SEL subject, and we'll write it all out this time, is going to be equal to our new function, and we're going to pass in SEL subj as the value, and that should set the value of select subject. So now we can work with it. So let's drop down here, and instead of asking for it to return the ID number, which we've currently set to this variable, let's make it select subject and ask for something more meaningful, like the menu name. In fact, we can take that whole bit of PHP right there, and let's just put it in place of where it says content area. There we go. Now I have the subject name displaying as the title of the page. So I'll save that, and let's go over to our browser, and let's take a look. If I click on Widget Corp, I get About Widget Corp. Products, I get products. Services, I get services. Now I'd like you to try to do the same thing for yourself with page and the page ID. Go ahead and create a function over here called get_page_by_ID. And do the exact same thing, but return a page, and use the page and put the page name up here if it's a page. Now notice, if I click on it here, we actually get an error because we're still running that SQL every time. If we look back at our code, right here, at the very top, every time we're going to get subject by ID, not just in the case where we actually have a subject. So what we also are going to need to do, in addition to building that page function, is we're going to need to move this up into our conditions here and incorporate it in our conditions so that it only tries to pull the subject down if subject has been sent, and it only tries to pull the page down if page has been sent. So go ahead and try that, and then after you've got that working, you'll also need to do the same thing down here. If subject has been sent, then show the subject name. If not, show the page name. So go ahead and try that on your own, and then in the next movie I'll show you the solution that I came up with.